I want to talk about metaphysics. Specifically, I want to talk about when physicists and materialists step outside of their field of expertise. A lot of times people will make metaphysical claims without realizing it, or they'll talk against metaphysics when it doesn't make any sense to do so. I don't want people to get the wrong idea and to think that I am anti-physics. So before I talk about this, I want to make it very clear that physics is incredible. It is amazing. Our current understanding of physics is incredibly accurate. This is not going to be a video criticizing physics. This is going to be a video criticizing when physicists step outside of their field of expertise. All right, what is metaphysics? First, let's define everything in the entire universe as just being information. It's all information. Consciousness, matter moving around, energy moving around. It's just all information. Physics tells us what information does. Physics can predict what information does. Physics is very good at this. What physics does not do is it doesn't tell us what information actually is. That would be metaphysics. Metaphysics tells us what information is. Physics tells us what it does. This is a very important distinction because a lot of times you will meet physicists or just materialists in general who wrongfully believe that physics does tell us what information is. Anytime a physicist talks about determinism, especially superdeterminism, free will, consciousness, or even if they are just attempting to define observation, they are stepping outside of their field of expertise. Physicists don't need to define any of those things in order to do physics. However, if they are trying to figure out how physics overlaps with those things, then they would need to have the definitions of them, which means they would have to consult a metaphysicist. So often will I hear physicists or fans of physics talk about consciousness as if it is nothing more than just information flowing in the brain, and they'll use that as a counter if you try to bring up consciousness in any regard. If you're trying to say like it has any properties that are significant, they'll say, well, no, consciousness, it's just a bunch of information flowing inside of your brain, which this infuriates me because the people who are saying that, they don't know what information is, because they could be completely correct and still be completely wrong. Even if consciousness is literally nothing more than just information flowing around the brain, that could still be incredibly significant depending on what information is. Those people have no idea what information is. Ideally, they would be consulting a metaphysicist so that they could learn what information is, and then they would make the claims about whether or not consciousness plays a key role in reality. But metaphysics is not an officially recognized field of expertise. You can go to college and you can take a philosophy class in metaphysics, but if you actually talk to people who go there, none of them have ever done metaphysics. None of them even want to do metaphysics. If you take a metaphysics class in college, you just learn how to argue about whether or not metaphysics is valid. Imagine taking a math class and no one ever learns any math. They just learn how to argue with each other about whether or not math is real. That'd be very frustrating, especially if you have been practicing math and you know how it works, and then you're talking to all these people and none of them can even make arguments about whether or not it's real because none of them have done math yet. All they know is how to argue about whether or not it's real. The vast majority of people who study metaphysics don't actually do metaphysics. I'm going to go into more detail about how to do metaphysics in a bit, but first, let's talk about how physics and metaphysics overlap. So, like almost all different fields, there will be areas where they overlap, and you have to either have someone be an expert in both, or you have to have the experts in both communicating with each other. Right now, quantum mechanics is the attempt to continue to advance physics in the area where it overlaps with metaphysics without consulting anyone who has ever actually studied metaphysics. So the entire field of quantum mechanics is essentially just a form of denial that metaphysics is needed in order to move forward in that specific regard. Imagine a marine biologist studying a species of life, and this species' behavior changes based on the temperature, and he wants to figure out why, but he also wants to know why the temperature is changing so radically in the first place, so he goes and he consults an oceanographer who can tell him why the temperature in this area is changing. What if they lived in a parallel universe that denied the validity of oceanographers? Would they just start claiming that the temperature changes are caused by some weird species of temperature fish? Yes. Yes, actually, that's exactly what they would do. And that is exactly what physicists are doing when they are really pushing the boundaries of quantum mechanics without addressing the fact that they need to be having metaphysicists in the room who make sure that they are staying within their field of expertise. All right, I want to get into some specific examples of when quantum mechanics is trying to overlap with metaphysics. This is not going to have anything to do with quantum manifestations or quantum jujitsu, quantum healing. This is not... None of that has anything to do with what I'm about to talk about. I'm just going to be critiquing when physicists are making metaphysical claims without realizing it, or when they are denouncing the need for metaphysical claims when they are actually needed. So let's start with wave-particle duality. Essentially, sometimes a particle can start behaving like a wave, and a wave can start behaving like a particle. Immediately, this raises questions as, okay, well, if a bit of information can just switch between those two states, what is it? What is something that can switch between those two things? Now, you don't have to know what it is in order to do some physics around it. You can figure out what it's doing to a degree. You can make predictions about it. You can make useful contraptions that utilize what it's doing, but you're really limited until, like, there's a lot to do with wave particle duality where it would be really nice if you knew what information actually is so that you could better understand this aspect of what it does. There's a lot of different theories as to what's going on with wave particle duality. And within a lot of those theories, there are a lot of physicists that are stepping outside of physics and attempting to answer metaphysical questions. Here's a short list of examples of the different types of interpretations people have, not just for wave particle duality, but for quantum mechanics in general. All of these different examples are really stepping on the line between predicting what information does and trying to explain what it is. Physics can only do the former. With something like superpositions, it almost feels like you're having a semantics argument against the universe itself. Observation plays a key role in superpositions, so it would be very nice if we could have a clear and set definition for what an observation actually is, but physics can't do that. That would be metaphysics that can define what an observation is. When physicists have to talk about what the relationship is between the observer and the collapse of a superposition, any of the theories that they come up with have to address or at least dance around the nature of what an observation is. The reason why observation is a metaphysical question is because if you were to ask a physicist, like, hey, define an observation, a lot of them will get uncomfortable and they'll say something along the lines of, well, we don't really know how to define it without just, saying that it's everything. Everything is an observation. That's a very good way to explain why it's not a physics question and why it's a metaphysics question, because metaphysics is the attempt to know what information is. And when you start thinking about observation, it's difficult to define it without just saying, well, everything is an observation. If everything's an observation, then you're getting closer to figuring out what information is, because everything is information. But anyway, physicists can make observations. They cannot define observation. So since observation is a very key and important factor in superpositions, they're always going to have this roadblock. Now on to the uncertainty principle. The uncertainty principle is basically that you can't know too much about a particle. If you try to figure out a lot of one aspect of its properties, you will know less and less about that property's complementary property. So if you want to know its exact position, you're not going to be able to know its momentum. I believe the most popular interpretation of the uncertainty principle is just that you have to interact with these things. So if it's moving at a certain speed and it has a certain position and you want to measure one of those things, you shoot another particle at it, bounce it off, and then you measure that, and you can figure out, let's say you figure out what its position is. That means that now you have no idea what the momentum is because you just smashed something into it. You changed its momentum, and now you'd have to do it again in order to get the correct momentum. But if you did that, then you would lose your understanding of its position. I believe that's the most popular interpretation. The problem with this is that it is assuming that this particle can have those properties outside of interaction. Those properties might exclusively exist within the context of interaction. Position and momentum might not exist outside of interaction. I made an entire video about this. It's called Certes. If a physicist ever tells you that particles have properties that exist outside of interaction, know that they are stepping outside of their field of expertise and they are starting to talk about what information actually is. They have no idea what they're talking about. Quantum entanglement. If you entangle two particles through their rotation, for example, you know for a fact that one of them has to be spinning, like, let's say clockwise, and then the other one has to be spinning counterclockwise, but you can't tell which is which. And in fact, it hasn't even been determined which is which, maybe, until you do something to them and then they collapse. And if you can find out which one is spinning clockwise, then the other one will magically, faster than light, immediately assume the counterpart state. Some of the arguments about interpretation, people will say, like, oh, well, the states are determined at the beginning as soon as they become entangled. Oh, no, the states are undetermined until the very end when it collapses. Some people believe in the multiple worlds interpretation, that as soon as you collapse it, it creates two universes where one is the other and the other is the other. Some people have proposed that there's this special form of invisible quantum information that can move at faster than light speeds in order to determine the relationship between both states. All of these things are like metaphysical in nature. They overlap with physics, but they also overlap with metaphysics. They're all like really stepping on the line of trying to determine what information is. Okay, so this is all great, but does it matter? Can we know what information is? Can we study what information is? How would we go about doing metaphysics? How do we learn what information is? The answer is pretty similar to how you do it in physics. So in physics, you learn more about physics. You do physics by changing what information does. So a lens in a telescope changes what light does, and it allows you to get new information. You could learn more about orbital mechanics and gravity and the properties of light by having it bend through a lens. A particle collider, you're radically changing what information is doing, smashing these things together and then learning about what it does by changing what it does, controlling what it does. So in order to advance metaphysics, you just do the metaphysical equivalent of that. In order to learn what information is, you have to change what information is in order to get a new perspective on what information is. Now, here we get to the part, one of the reasons why it's not an officially recognized field, and why it's not, why I get really upset when people say that they teach it in college. They don't. If you take a metaphysics class in college, it's just nonsense. So the people who are actually doing metaphysics are the hippies who are dropping acid, because what they're doing when they take LSD is they are just completely modifying what information is. Spoiler alert, you are information. By taking LSD, or another method that you could do is just do intense meditation, although that takes a lot longer. You have to practice that a whole bunch. Also things like magic mushrooms and DMT. I made a whole video on psychedelics called Psychedelics. But the point is, in order to learn what information is, you have to change what information is in order to gain a new perspective. If the absolute baseline processes of what your consciousness is doing, of what you are, the information that you are comprised of, has been altered, you now gain completely new insight on consciousness, on the nature of observation, on everything that you've ever learned. You get a new perspective on all of that information. And you can learn a tremendous amount of extremely logical things. Like, for example, the stuff that I personally learned, I put some of it into my video called Certes. I already talked about that one, but it really is that simple. In order to learn what information does, change what information does. In order to learn what information is, you change what information is. Metaphysics. Join the cult.